Hello, dear friends. Welcome. Thank you for joining me here. I'm Ari Theriger, and as it is tradition in this channel during the month of October, I always deliver or try to deliver information within the mood of the season. And for our last video of October this year, 2025, allow me to develop on a subject related to Halloween, of course, but I haven't spoken of it before. So I'll go straight to it. Halloween may have largely replaced Samhain, but that is still one of the most important festivals in the pagan year. Samhain, that is, which is the last of the three harvest festivals for pagans, marking the beginning of winter in old calendars. As said here before, last year actually, the Christian All Hallowtide, held on the same day as Samhain, October 31st, preserved the association with the dead, with the departed. The departed seem to have, indeed, always been the key focus of this celebration. At least in several Neolithic tombs, we already understand that they have been constructed to allow the light of sunrise on Samhain precisely to illuminate the interior. So we see it was intentional on this day, the natural light of the world to illuminate the dwellings of the dead. And the earliest descriptions of Samhain come from Irish literature, of course. It shows this has been a time to end farming and warfare-related activities and to gather families and tribes together to survive the winter. So this was also a dangerous time, as folklore tells us. At Samhain, the fairies would open their mounds, and it was possible for the dead to return from the spirit realm. So, nothing new here, right? This is all subjects I've talked about here before, but this little bit serves just as a reminder of the old festival that in part influenced what would become Halloween. So, let us speak of modern Halloween now. One of the most famous traditions of this modern celebration is, of course, trick or treat. A tradition that blends ancient and modern origins of giving and receiving gifts of candy. So picture this, trick or treating. Some children are at your doorstep, singing, demanding cake or candy or else. Does this sound familiar to you? Of course it does. Only 5th century before the Common Era kids will remember, especially from the Greek island of Rhodes. The children at your doorstep are singing a familiar song called the Swallow Song, a folk chant in a tradition that was apparently started by the poet and one of the 7 sages of Greece, Cleobulus. To show gratitude for the return of the migratory swallows, who mark the end of winter, you give the children the fruitcake and cheese and bread that they ask for. Maybe even a little bit of wine. Sure, they are children, but it's in ancient Greece. The singing of the Swallow Song is the earliest recorded instance of what today we call trick or treat, in part preserved by the 2nd century of the Common Era writer Athenaeus of Naucratis. Athenaios or Navkratitis. It sounds better in ancient Greek, right? Especially Navkratitis. Sorry, I got lost in the titis part. I'll put a note here on his work. Well, the Swallow Song is not directly related to the medieval British and Irish practices that are the ancestors of the modern trick or treat tradition today. It points to a far older cultural heritage for the practice of knocking on a neighbor's door and offering to swap chaos for candy. But it is curious, this piece of history from Greek origins anyway, and of course an excuse to say titties on YouTube. All right, I'll stop with that now. Trick or treating today is what many folklorists call child lore. Which is all the games and stories and even mythologies and rituals passed down by children. Nowadays, as soon as a person reaches teenagehood, I don't know if that's a word, but you get the point, well, it is considered too old, that person is considered too old to go on trick or treating. It's just weird these days to see people who are no longer children continuing to participate in this tradition, right? As tradition goes in modern Halloween, this is the province of children, right? However, things were very different in the Middle Ages in Britain. Trick or treating was very much the province of adults. This practice was called mumming, and it goes back at least the early Middle Ages in Britain, and it involves a group dressing up as figures, adults actually dressing up as figures from local or more widely known folklore, and traveling around the local area acting out small scenes. The plays and characters changed with the seasons. It was often with the aim at creating a comedy play based on mystery. Take it as a story with a religious allegory, right? So the characters varied according to the seasons and celebrations, but it was almost always religious and mythological figures from Christian religious conceptions, including, of course, dressing up as the devil. But it was a little bit different, very different actually, during the period of Hallowtide, when they became, these people dressed up as characters became solars. And instead of performing, they went from door to door offering blessings for the living and prayers for the dead in exchange for a very specific seasonal delicacy, soul cakes. I've already talked about this on a previous video, but just as a reminder, these were little flat scones studded with dried fruits, with sweet spices, and often marked with a cross. So these were alms given out to those who asked for them. In return, the solars promised to say prayers for the giver's dead relatives with the intention of speeding their spiritual progress from purgatory to heaven. These cakes are far more familiar to the ancient Greek tradition, right? So solars also offered wishes for good health and increase in fertility to the householders and their livestock in exchange for cakes, alcohol, or money. Here in Portugal, we have a similar tradition. We call it pão por Deus, bread for God, which is held on All Saints' Day, the 1st of November. It's a tradition that is dying out today, and it's far more common in rural areas nowadays. So children go out chanting, crying, shouting pão por Deus, and singing songs, and are given buns, nuts, and candy by householders. If treats are not given, insults and curses follow, right? Curses as in wishing ill outcomes by conjuring death, hunger, and are just as bad sort of fates. So this tradition in Portugal was first recorded in the 15th century. It's actually very likely that it was Portuguese sailors of the 16th and 17th centuries who exported this tradition much further into other regions, other countries, even outside Europe. So Greek, Irish, and Portuguese traditions culminating in a Christian Europe to speed the way of the dead from purgatory to heaven on All Hallows Day. Dressing up as monsters and creatures of folklore is another common theme in trick or treating traditions, right? Such traditions were first recorded in Scotland by the 16th century, spreading into the rest of Britain and Ireland. And in some parts of Ireland, Halloween saw similar traditions to the Welsh Christmas time practice of Mari Lwyd. A man dresses up as the White Mare and would lead a group around the neighborhood reciting verses in exchange for treats. Of course, these traditions ended up in the US at some point. We shall get to that. In fact, shortly after President Abraham Lincoln declaring Thanksgiving a national holiday in 1870, it also became a New York tradition for children to dress in scary costumes on Ragamuffin Day and go out asking for candy. By the 1930s, this has been deliberately subsumed into organized Thanksgiving Day parades with children walking dressed in elaborate outfits. Mostly it was Disney characters that were the most popular costumes at this time. So the modern day term trick or treat first appears in an article published in the Lethbridge Herald in Alberta, Canada, in late 1927, referring to the Halloween festivities in a small town called Blackie. It describes groups of children crying or shouting trick or treat, roaming the village and knocking at doors. Before 1927, there's no way of knowing where the term came from, trick or treat, or trick or treating, and indeed when children started to shout trick or treat. It is unknowable for now. Well then, the tradition of carving pumpkins, right? I think I have already addressed this in part in some other previous video, in some other Halloween, but I would like to give a little bit more detail, right? At some point, I might make a compilation of the videos I have done in the past throughout these years concerning the history of Halloween. Well, I think it's safe to say that pumpkins are the most common symbols of Halloween, especially carving up pumpkins to look like grotesque faces. Nowadays, special types of pumpkins are actually grown for the sole purpose of easily carving them with a pleasant shape and vibrant orange color, just for this time of the year. But where did this tradition started? That's the point. Well, its proper name is jack-o'-lantern. That's the name of the carved pumpkin. It is an Irish folk tale which tells us the story of a tinker known as Stingy Jack. There are several versions of the story that dates back to the 17th and the 18th centuries, but in the most common variant, Jack ran into the devil and he invited him to have a drink with him, as one normally does. It's just in the rules of being polite. So Jack told the devil that he didn't want to pay for their drinks and had devised a trick so that they wouldn't have to. The devil agreed, so when Jack told him to turn himself, the devil, into a coin, he did. Jack then put the coin in his pocket next to his rosary, and the religious symbol prevented the devil from turning back into his natural form. Eventually, Jack agreed to move the coin away from the crucifix so that the devil could change back into his proper natural shape, but only after extracting a promise that the devil would leave Jack alone for one year. So a year later, the devil returned for his revenge. Jack was busy picking apples and explained that he would be ready for his punishment as soon as he had finished. He was having trouble, he said, reaching the apples at the top of the tree. Perhaps the devil could be of some assistance by picking those very far away on top of the tree. Then he'd be finished quicker and ready to atone for his tricks upon the devil. The devil climbed into the treetop. Jack promptly carved a cross into the tree trunk, trapping the devil in its branches. This time he made the devil make two promises: that the devil would leave him alone for 10 years and that the devil would never claim his soul. With no other choice, the devil agreed. So there are, of course, other more violent versions of this tale that has Jack trapping the devil in a chair or a bag and beating him with a blackthorn stick until he relents, which is curious, as blackthorn is highly associated with witchcraft, particularly in British and Irish folklore, where it is associated with both dark magic and protection. But anyway, after 10 years have passed, Jack died. He had behaved badly in life, so he wasn't allowed in heaven, but hell refused to admit him as well. After all, the devil promised he would never claim Jack's soul, And the devil was understandably pissed with Jack and his clever little tricks. The devil gave Jack a burning coal from hell, condemning him to wander at night for eternity with only the amber to light his way. So Jack carved a turnip and put it inside, and for that, his wandering ghost became known as Jack-o'-lantern, a slang term for a night watchman. So, the wandering soul, especially the damned soul, wandering about and stuck between heaven and hell, or somewhere in between, is a common theme during Halloween time. After all, the very Christian tradition of Hallowtide is to pray for the souls of those stuck in purgatory and other places in between, so that such souls can ascend to heaven. But this tale also has its origins on the folk tales and legends of a crafty person's capability, or a crafty person being capable of tricking an evil spirit. In Western Europe, for instance, the most well-known of these tales is that of Saint Dunstan and the Devil, quite similar in part to the tale of Jack-o'-lantern. The 10th century Saint Dunstan was a metal worker, blacksmith, but unlike Jack, he was a devout holy man. And he used his blacksmithing tools to grab the devil by the nose and menace him into leaving his congregation alone. Both of these examples show craftsmen, so a human, usually one who works with fire, which is a key element of ancient Halloween celebrations, scaring off the forces of evil, whether through cunning or through holiness, and the element of fire to light up the dark season ahead. But the case of the turnip that carries hellfire is quite curious. You see, in ancient Celtic art, and it's quite noticeable in the western half of Europe, particularly in countries where it is nowadays Portugal, Spain, France, and parts of Central Europe, the motif of the head, particularly the severed head, is quite noticeable. This is known as the head cult, which can be traced back through pre-Celtic settlements to at least the Mesolithic. And in the Iron Age, Roman writers have recorded that Celtic warriors or warriors of Celticized cultures took the heads of their foes as trophies and displayed them on spikes outside their settlements, or embalmed and preserved them, the heads as relics. So Celtic artisans carved heads into pieces of masonry as well. So this same cult of the head eventually reaches the British Isles in a later period, where we see the ends of torques, for instance, neck pieces of jewelry in the form of a ring, which at their ends there's human heads, thought to ward off evil spirits and evil influences. The head was venerated as the seat of wisdom and as the seat of the soul, the very conduit through which God spoke to humans, and it was the very symbol of divinity. This is the origins of the head of Mimir in Norse mythology, as an example. It comes from a later period, from continental Western Europe and Central Europe. The head of Mimir, the very severed head of wisdom who speaks to Odin, revealing hidden secrets and ancient wisdom. So it's possible that during this period, head carvings and possibly actual heads made an appearance or had their part to play in rituals. So turnips with carved faces seem to be somewhat vestiges of this ancient pre-Christian head cult. The cult of the head as an apotropaic charm includes parts of the head as well, like that of the evil eye, precisely, and eye symbols to ward off evil. So the carved turnip with hell's fire is this evil repelling charm. So when European settlers arrived in what would become the United States of America in the 16th century, they were introduced to a wealth of fruit and vegetables that they had never encountered before. More specifically, they came about the Native American system of planting, the so-called Three Sisters, right? The Three Sisters method of planting corn, beans, and squash. And this was rapidly integrated into the diet system of the colonizers and settlers. But it is in today's Massachusetts that the earliest settlers and settlements would come about the most common type of squash, which was referred to by English settlers and colonizers as pompion, from the Latin word for melon. In the language of the locals, somewhere here on the screen, it was this word, right, meaning grows round. Today we know them as pumpkins, as you might have figured it out. So the settlers who first arrived in Massachusetts were predominantly Puritans, and their beliefs about Halloween were quite different, very different to those of other Christians at the time. They preserved very, very, very few of its older folkloric traditions and rather concentrated on their self-imposed idea that it was just evil. So Puritans considered almost anything evil. They were probably terrified of just being alive. In a time period where the utmost religious concern was the existence of witches and malefic threats, since the devil was afoot, what Puritans would adopt from the old continent and old beliefs was mostly any type of folk magic practices they thought would keep evil away. The settlement of Massachusetts predates the first recorded instance of the Stingy Jack tale by at least a century. It's funny, actually, that it's the very apotropaic beliefs of the ancient Celtic head cult, which was completely unknown to the Puritans, these origins, obviously, but these folk tales and these symbols and beliefs, probably brought on by Protestant, Scottish, and Irish immigrants escaping persecution by Catholics at the time, were the very things that appealed to the Puritans' beliefs. The idea of warding off demons, witches, evil spirits, the devil itself, and whatnot, with a turnip lantern, was a perfect fit into the Puritans' superstitions about Halloween. Turnips, however, were an old world, let's say, old world crop, a continental European crop that was hard to come by in the ancestral lands of the Native Americans. But pumpkins, however, were relatively abundant and easier to carve. Thus, the jack-o'-lantern's modern form was born, that of a pumpkin. Pumpkins are not the only foodstuff to play a role in Halloween. The tradition of apple bobbing has also become synonymous with Halloween, albeit less famous, of course. The apple's connection to Halloween may have a connection to the Celts, maybe, or rather, more specifically, continental Celtic influences into the Gaelic festival of Samhain at some point in the Iron Age. As you know, the apple was a sacred fruit for Celts or Celticized peoples. The same can be said more or less concerning the symbolic connotations or importance in biblical scriptures, of course, obviously. However, the apple does appear in several myths and legends of a Celtic cultural root, of a pan-Celtic cultural root. But of course, by the time many of these legends were committed into parchment or to written form, the Christian influence upon such tales and myths was already very noticeable. Still, there's no doubt that by the time Samhain was celebrated, apples were ripe for the picking. So apple bobbing, picking apples with your mouth from a container with water as a form of entertainment has its origins on the use of apple or apples for divinatory purposes. Apple bobbing or apple ducking appears to have been quite popular in the past, especially in the late Middle Ages. We don't know how divination was actually done, conducted, and perceived with the use of apples, but that's one of those things. It remains recorded in history as a practice, but with no clear instructions. At some point, by the 18th century, actually, this entertainment became so popular that in some parts of England, Halloween was known as Snap Apple Night rather than Halloween, probably due to the religious connotations of Halloween, right? Not much its pagan past, but the Catholic background of Halloween. The evangelical revival in England in the 18th century was a major religious movement. Protestantism was the dominant religion in England, with Catholics by that time becoming a minority. So it makes sense changing the name to Snap Apple Night rather than Halloween or Hallowtide, those terms related to this season by Catholics. And concerning divination with apples, specifically during this period, that's part of the theme of this season, really. Halloween has always been regarded as a highly spiritual period, especially taking into account the belief that the dead and other spirits can visit this world again, which means the dead can provide information into one's own fate. This is perhaps one of the major reasons why folklore is full of tricks and tips on how to practice fortune telling at this time, specifically at this time of the year, which is considered to be particularly potent in magic provided by supernatural forces. This is the entire premise of the origins of necromancy. And soothsaying traditions and related superstitions are commonly related to this time, right? So, speaking of the dead, we have another tradition for this season, the Dumb Supper. People may die and be gone from the world of the living, but there were many rituals designed to help the living communicate with the dead, with the departed, and also feed the dead. This harks back to an animistic perception of the continuation of relating with the dead and building and maintaining beneficial relationships, relationships with those who have been important to us while alive, so that they may continue to provide something beneficial to the living, of course. And like all yearly celebrations, which one way or another within animism requires an effort to create, maintain, and renew or establish relationships with spirits to continue to provide beneficial aspects to the community of the living through rituals, the period of Halloween is no different. Food and the dead are intimately tied in many cultures. Many cultures have had and still have the custom of leaving foodstuff in the tombs and other dwelling places of the departed. This has been for a variety of reasons, of course, including, for instance, to appease the dead, as well as fear of the return of the dead and the harmful impact of the angry dead, which is why in the first place you try to appease them with food. However, some rituals invite the dead to a more intimate meal, and the Dumb Supper is what remains of such rituals. That's where I wanted to reach. A meal that is held in silence, as silence is a common part of death rituals, which provides sensory deprivation to help to be more attentive to what goes around us. But death rituals and rituals towards the departed take place at many moments of the year. And while some are clearly to keep the dead away, and others, of course, to maintain beneficial relationships with the dead, as in having a continuous help from the departed in the affairs of the living and in life, at other moments of the year, some of these rituals invite the dead to share special moments. The Dumb Supper reflects these ancient rituals of inviting the dead into taking part in our lives. Still, these rituals were meant to strengthen the connection and relationship with the dead precisely at a moment of transition. You see, in animism, the yearly moments that mark a change in the cycle of life and of nature, and obviously on the communities of the living, are precisely the moments where ritual is held to rebuild and maintain and even create relationships with other than human persons, spirits if you will, to keep on having the beneficial outcomes of such persons, of other than human persons, what they provide, the benefits they provide to the community of the living. So, at this moment of transition, it seems to have been more of a display of appreciation and a means to acknowledge the effort of the spirits and their role in providing beneficial things to the community of the living, obviously, and to be grateful, to show that people are grateful for their presence. So, taking into consideration that Samhain marked the end of the year and the beginning of the new cycle in old calendars, of course, these death rituals at this period were not just to maintain and renew relationships with the spirits of those who still play a beneficial role in the community of the living and to carry it on to the next cycle, but the moment to show gratitude for the help provided in the past cycles that are now to come to an end and all begins again. Of course, these animistic beliefs and attitudes have sadly, unfortunately, become quite lost in time, especially in our Western societies and societies that ended up being repressed and influenced by the religious beliefs of colonizers, particularly religious beliefs of Protestantism, especially evangelical and Puritans, which see these traditions as superstitions and an invitation given to evil. So, in a way, these animistic pre-Christian beliefs towards the departed during this celebration survived through Catholicism. After all, even though the origins of Halloween, of course, in part are pagan and pre-Christian, many of its traditions and religious connotations are tied to the calendar of the Church, particularly to the Catholic Church. Halloween derives from All Hallows Eve, the night before All Saints' Day, when the memory of the saints is celebrated. As said in the previous video in last year's October, in the Middle Ages, a feast day was preceded by a day of fasting. Fasting was used to make worshippers more holy. But fasting also makes people quite hungry. This was a tradition within Catholicism since the early 11th century until the 1960s. This fasting was not an absence of all types of food, mind you, but rather restriction of the types of food that could be eaten in non-celebratory religious days. This is particularly interesting, the taboos on food in moments of spiritual relevance, which harks back to animistic beliefs, especially not eating particular types of animals or not eating animals at all, as in many animistic societies. Even today, many animals are understood to be the spirits of ancestors, which throughout the year may provide sustenance to the living, to the community of the living, through sacrifice, giving themselves to sacrifice and then consecrating their bodies, but on special occasions to honor the departed, to honor the dead, the ancestors, many animals are not eaten because they may be ancestors, and in these specific occasions you are not inviting the departed to take part in your life and in the celebration held towards them so that you can eat them. So you do not eat them at these periods. So it's particularly interesting, this animistic attitude having survived in Catholicism for quite some time. But well, there was to be no meat on Halloween, and this perhaps explains why the food eaten at Halloween is usually sweet treats and not actually substantial meals, especially in Catholic countries. Perhaps this is also the reason why some of these sweets and other dishes that do not contain meat but may contain fish are left out for fairies at night. Fairies in many traditions of Europe are often considered ancestors of the dead. Not all fairies are spirits of the dead, mind you, but some people upon death can become fairies or elves. So trick or treat in part is just a modern version of a much older tradition or much older traditions of asking for sweets to eat during this time of certain food taboos. Again, remember what was previously said, right? Solars asking for fruit cakes in exchange of a prayer for the dead so that they can depart more quickly and leave purgatory for good. The giving and receiving of soul cakes was a religious act, or what remained as part of an ancient ritual to avoid eating certain animals that may anger the spirits. This attitude may anger the spirits with which we have created beneficial relationships, and at this time of the year, and we celebrate those relationships with respect and avoiding disrespectful behavior towards the spirits, so they may continue to be part of our cycles of life. This is probably why apples, at least in part, were so famous during this time of the year, both, of course, as fruits ready to be eaten at this period, but as foodstuff that isn't meat. Well, from the mid-20th century onwards, trick-or-treating became the most popular Halloween activity for children, and very much what we know of Halloween today, as it is celebrated today, is an American celebration, right? From what is celebrated today, we have a clear distinction between past historical Halloweens and Hallowtides from the American celebration, which is modern Halloween. We could say that modern Halloween sprang from the melting pot of cultures in the 19th century USA, and it turned into an American celebration, re-exported back to the rest of the world. And it's quite funny that most countries in Europe which celebrated these festivities of this time of the year for centuries now celebrate or participate in the USA version of it. I mean, it's funny. Centuries of traditions quickly lost their popularity and were replaced by something quite new in a matter of just a century or even less than that, with the help of mass media and Hollywood. And that's a good example of US soft power. So there's a crucial turn of events here at some point. You see, during the 19th century, potato famine across Ireland led many Irish people to leave their homeland for the New World. Until this point, most holidays were banned by the United States puritanical establishment, and any mention of witchcraft could result in some cruel punishment or fate. But with the immigration of the Irish into the US came many myths and superstitions and folklore and legends, part of the Irish identity, and it kept on surviving precisely to keep the identity of a people in a new society, which is the result of a great mixture of cultures. So the Irish Catholics had never given up on their Hallowtide celebration, along with the folk tales, myths, and legends of pre-Christian origins, which gave some body to the Hallowtide Catholic celebration itself. The Irish immigrants had reached nearly 2 million by 1819. So the cultural and traditional aspects of Ireland brought into the US had a considerable weight at that time. Traditions such as lighting bonfires, superstitions, folk tales, guising, divination, and all that were strong cultural factors these immigrants kept alive precisely in an attempt to hold on to their traditions, precisely to highlight their ethnicity in a new society. And with the rise of magazines, it helped to shape and popularize these traditions, especially those of Halloween in the US, through short stories and other short pieces of literature. You see, Halloween became the most popular Gaelic celebration in the US, both because the Irish immigrants, as I said, had a considerable weight in US society by the end of the 19th century, but also because this was the Catholic celebration of Hallowtide, aimed at the ancestors, in most part aimed at the departed. Now, for a group of people who left their homeland and trying to keep their traditions alive in a new land and new society, it is precisely through celebrations aimed at ancestors and their ancestry, aimed at the past people of an ethnic group, that will have more impact in this attempt to survive and highlight one's cultural and ethnic identity. Of course, Halloween became even more popularized with technological advancements in the movie business. During the 50s, monster culture captivated the public who owned televisions at home, thanks to Universal Pictures' package of over 50 horror films released directly onto television screens. Halloween then adopted several monster icons such as Dracula and Frankenstein's monster and others, and in turn these characters influenced the overall look of Halloween in general. Halloween would directly influence television and filmmaking in return. During the 60s of the past century, Halloween television specials were starting to export the idea of Halloween to the rest of the world, and shows like Bewitched and Addams Family aired Halloween specials too. By the 90s, almost all US television shows had aired at least one Halloween episode. The Simpsons, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, South Park, Goosebumps, you remember those? And more, of course, all had Halloween specials. And of course, a classic. John Carpenter's 1978 film Halloween became one of the most successful independent films of all time, which actually gave the very real first taste of American Halloween to people outside the US. Thus, modern Halloween was established. My dear friends, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, thank you for today. Happy Halloween. Until we meet again, my dear friends.